The glass shattered against the marble floor before Grace Bennet even realized her hand had moved. Red wine spread across the pale stone like a wound opening in the middle of the grand hallway, and for a moment she could not breathe. Somewhere behind her, heavy footsteps stopped. She did not need to turn around to know who it was. Everyone in that house knew the sound of those footsteps. They belonged to Daniel Whitmore, the man 12 women had tried to marry in the last 2 years, and 12 women had been sent away without so much as a handshake. Grace turned slowly, her heart pounding so hard she was sure he could hear it. Daniel stood at the top of the staircase, dressed in black, his expression unreadable. He was not shouting. He never shouted. That was almost worse. His silence had a weight to it, like the seconds before a storm breaks. "I am sorry," Grace whispered, already kneeling to gather the broken pieces of glass with her bare hands, not thinking clearly, only wanting to fix what she had ruined. "Stop," Daniel said, his voice low but firm enough to freeze her fingers mid-motion. "You will cut yourself." She looked up at him, startled. In the 6 weeks she had worked in this house, he had never once addressed her directly. He spoke through his assistant, through notes left on the kitchen counter, through the housekeeper who managed the staff. But never like this, never looking straight at her as though she were a person and not simply part of the furniture. He walked down the stairs, each step slow and deliberate, and crouched beside her. Up close, she noticed things she had never allowed herself to notice before. The faint tiredness around his eyes, the small scar above his left eyebrow, the way his jaw tightened, not from anger but from something else entirely, something she could not name. "Give me your hand," he said. "It is nothing, sir, just a small cut." "Give me your hand, Grace." The way he said her name made her chest tighten. She had never thought he even knew it. He took her hand gently, turning it toward the light, checking for glass. His fingers were rough, the hands of a man who had built an empire, yet his touch was careful, almost hesitant, as if he were afraid of causing more harm than the shattered glass already had. "It is fine," he said finally, releasing her hand. "Go clean yourself up. I will deal with this." Grace stood on shaking legs, unsure whether she should thank him or apologize again. Before she could decide, he spoke once more, quieter this time, almost to himself. "Nobody has looked at me the way you just did in a very long time." She did not understand what he meant. She had only been afraid of losing her job, afraid of his reputation, afraid of the rumors that followed him like a shadow through the city. But something in his voice told her this moment mattered more than she realized. That night, alone in the small staff quarters at the back of the mansion, Grace sat on her bed and stared at the ceiling, replaying the scene over and over. She thought of her mother back in the countryside, sick and waiting for the money Grace sent home every month. She thought of how desperately she needed this job, and how one clumsy accident could have ended everything. And yet, strangely, that accident had not ended anything. It had started something instead. She did not know, not yet, that Daniel Whitmore had spent the last 2 years refusing every woman his family tried to introduce him to. Powerful women, wealthy women, beautiful women from respected families, all of them turned away at the door before dinner was even served. His mother had grown tired of arranging meetings that always ended the same way. His closest friend and business partner, Nathan Pierce, had stopped asking questions about marriage altogether, assuming Daniel simply did not want a life outside the one he had built, a life of danger, power, and control. But something had shifted the moment. A maid dropped a glass of wine and looked at him with more fear for his feelings than for her own safety. The next morning, Grace was called into his study. Her hands trembled as she knocked on the heavy wooden door, unsure what to expect. Would she be fired? Would he simply overlook the moment entirely, pretend it never happened, the way powerful men often did with the people who served them? "Come in," his voice called. She stepped inside. Daniel sat behind his desk, papers spread in front of him, but his eyes lifted the moment she entered, and they stayed on her. "Sit," he said. I would rather stand, sir, if that is all right. A faint smile crossed his face, gone almost as quickly as it appeared. Very well, I wanted to ask you something. Grace held her breath. Why did you apologize so many times last night? It was an accident. Accidents happen. Because I know what people say about this house, she admitted quietly. I did not want to give anyone a reason to remember me badly. Daniel leaned back in his chair, studying her with an intensity that made her want to look away, yet she could not. You are the first person in this house who has ever spoken to me honestly, he said. Everyone else tells me what they think I want to hear. I only told you the truth, sir. That is exactly my point. The conversation ended there, but something had shifted between them, subtle and quiet, like the first crack of light through a closed curtain. Over the following days, Grace noticed small changes. Daniel began arriving in the kitchen earlier than usual, right when she was setting the morning trays. He asked about her work, her family, her plans, questions he had never bothered to ask any of the household staff before. The other maids noticed too, and their whispers followed her through the hallways like a second shadow. He has never looked twice at anyone, said Ellie, one of the older maids, her voice sharp with suspicion one afternoon while they folded linens together. Be careful, Grace. Men like him do not fall in love. They collect people and then they discard them. Grace wanted to believe Ellie was wrong, but she also knew the danger in hopping for something that was likely nothing more than curiosity on his part. Daniel Whitmore was not simply a wealthy businessman. Beneath the surface of galas, charity dinners, and expensive suits, everyone in the city knew what his family truly controlled. The kind of power that did not ask permission. The kind of power that made enemies disappear and made friends who feared him more than they respected him. And yet, when Grace saw him alone late one evening in the garden, sitting by himself with a drink he had not touched, staring at nothing, she did not see a dangerous man. She saw someone profoundly lonely. You should not be out here without a coat, she said, approaching him carefully, holding a folded blanket she had brought from inside without quite deciding to bring it. He looked up surprised. You worry about me. Everyone deserves someone to worry about them, sir. He took the blanket from her hands, his fingers brushing hers for just a moment, and that brief touch sent a warmth through her chest that had nothing to do with the blanket at all. Sit with me, he said, just for a moment. I should not, sir. It would not be appropriate. Since when have you cared about what is appropriate, Grace? You dropped a glass of wine in front of me and apologized like the world was ending. She could not help the small laugh that escaped her, and for the first time since she had started working in that house, she saw Daniel Whitmore smile fully, an unguarded smile that changed his entire face. She sat. They spoke for nearly an hour that night, about nothing important and everything important at the same time. He told her about his father, a man who had built the family business through fear rather than respect, and how Daniel had inherited both the empire and the loneliness that came with it. She told him about her mother, about growing up with very little, about how she had come to the city with nothing but a suitcase and a hope that things would be different. Neither of them noticed how late it had grown until Nathan Pierce appeared at the garden entrance, his expression tightening the moment he saw them sitting together. Daniel, Nathan said carefully, glancing at Grace before looking back at his friend. We need to talk now. Daniel stood immediately, his posture shifting, the softness from moments before disappearing like it had never existed. Grace recognized the change. She had seen it in others before, the way certain men could switch between two entirely different versions of themselves in an instant. Go inside, Grace, Daniel said, his voice suddenly distant. It is late. She nodded and walked away, but she could feel Nathan's eyes following her the entire way, sharp and calculating, as though he were trying to decide exactly how much of a problem she had just become. What Grace did not know, as she climbed the stairs back to her small room that night, was that Nathan had come to deliver a warning far more serious than concerns about propriety. A rival family, one that had been quietly building resentment against the Whitmore name for years, had learned something they should never have learned. And that knowledge was about to put everyone in that house, including the maid who had simply spilled a glass of wine, directly in danger. Grace lay awake that night, unaware that the innocent mistake which had brought her closer to Daniel Whitmore had also placed her, without her knowledge or consent, into a world of secrets, power, and danger from which there would be no simple way back. The knock on Grace's door came just after midnight, sharp and urgent, nothing like the polite taps she usually heard from the other staff. She opened it to find Daniel standing there himself, something she had never imagined would happen, his coat still on, his face pale under the hallway light. "Pack a bag," he said, "quickly, do not turn on the main lights." "What is happening?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "There is no time to explain everything right now. I need you to trust me." Grace had learned enough about the world she had stepped into to know that when a man like Daniel Whitmore asked you to trust him at midnight, something had gone terribly wrong. She grabbed a small bag, stuffing in only what mattered, and followed him down the back staircase, the one the staff used to avoid being seen by guests. Nathan was waiting by a black car at the rear entrance, his expression grim. "This is a mistake," he said quietly to Daniel, not bothering to hide his disapproval even with Grace standing right there. "Bringing her along puts everyone at greater risk." "Leaving her behind puts her at greater risk," Daniel replied firmly. "They know she works in this house now. That is enough for them." Grace's stomach twisted. Who knows what do they know? Daniel opened the car door for her, his hand steady despite the tension radiating from his shoulders. "The Castellano family," he said finally, once they were moving, the city lights sliding past the windows. "My father made an agreement with them years ago, one that was never meant to become public. Recently, someone leaked details of that agreement, and they believe I intend to break it." "Do you intend to break it?" He was quiet for a long moment. "I intend to end it the right way, legally, quietly, without anyone getting hurt, but the Castellanos do not believe in quiet endings." Grace stared out the window, trying to process the fact that her employer, the man she had shared a blanket and an hour of honest conversation with in a garden, was now driving her away from danger in the middle of the night because someone believed she mattered to him enough to be used against him. "Why does my presence matter to them at all?" she asked. "I am only a maid." Daniel glanced at her, and in that glance she saw something raw and unguarded, something he had clearly not intended to reveal so soon. "Because you matter to me," he said simply, "and they know it." Nathan, sitting in the front passenger seat, exhaled sharply but said nothing. Grace understood then that Nathan's earlier warning in the garden had not been about propriety at all. It had been about exactly this. Somehow, the rival family had learned of Daniel's growing attachment to her before she herself had fully understood it. They arrived at a smaller property outside the city, tucked behind tall gates and thick trees, a house Grace had never known existed. Daniel explained it belonged to his mother's side of the family, kept private and unlisted for situations exactly like this one. Inside, the air felt calmer, though the tension in Daniel's shoulders did not ease. "You will stay here until this is resolved," he told her, guiding her to a quiet room upstairs. "There is a security team on the grounds. Nobody will find you." "And what about you?" she asked. "Where will you be?" "I have matters to handle." "Dangerous matters." He did not answer, which was answer enough. Grace stepped closer to him, surprising herself with her own boldness. "I did not ask for any of this," she said, "but I am not sorry it happened. I am only afraid of what it might cost you." Daniel reached out, his hand brushing a strand of hair away from her face, his touch gentle despite everything happening around them. "For the first time in years," he said quietly, "I do not feel like I am simply protecting an empire. I feel like I am protecting something worth protecting." He left before dawn, and Grace spent the following days in a strange, quiet limbo, surrounded by unfamiliar staff who treated her with careful politeness but clearly did not know what to make of her sudden presence. She spent hours by the window, watching the gates, waiting for any sign of him returning. Meanwhile, across the city, Daniel sat across from Marco Castellano, the eldest son of the rival family, in a private meeting arranged through years of careful diplomacy. Marco was a sharp man, calm in a way that made him more dangerous than anyone who shouted or threatened outright. "Your father made promises," Marco said, sliding a folder across the table. "Promises that benefited our family for over a decade. Now you wish to end them because it no longer suits your conscience." "The arrangement was built on activities I want no part of," Daniel replied evenly. "I am offering you a fair transition, legitimate business ventures that could benefit both families without the risks that come with the old ways." Marco studied him for a long moment. "And the maid, is she part of this new conscience of yours as well?" Daniel's jaw tightened. "She has nothing to do with our business." "She has everything to do with it the moment you decided to protect her the way you have. Weakness is not something my family tolerates in a partner, Daniel. Attachments make men predictable. Predictable men make mistakes. I am not asking for your approval of my personal life. I am asking for a peaceful resolution to a business matter." Marco leaned back, a thin smile crossing his face. "Peaceful resolutions require trust, and trust requires proof that you are still the man capable of making difficult decisions. Perhaps proving that starts with removing distractions." The threat, though never spoken directly, hung heavy in the air. Daniel left the meeting with a controlled expression, but inside, fear gripped him in a way it never had during any previous negotiation. This was no longer only about business. It was about Grace's safety, and he understood now that keeping her hidden might not be enough. Back at the private estate, Grace had grown restless with waiting. She wandered the gardens, spoke briefly with the household staff, and eventually struck up a quiet friendship with a young woman named Charlotte, who worked as a cook for Daniel's mother whenever she visited. "You should be careful who you trust in this family," Charlotte warned one afternoon while preparing dinner. "Not because they are bad people, but because the world around them is complicated. Daniel's mother, for instance, has strong opinions about who belongs in this family." "I am not trying to belong anywhere," Grace said honestly. "I am only trying to survive whatever this is." Charlotte smiled softly. "That is exactly how love starts sometimes. Nobody plans it. It simply happens, and then you spend the rest of your life trying to survive the consequences of it." Days passed slowly, tension building with each hour Daniel remained away. When he finally returned, exhaustion clear in the lines of his face, Grace rushed to meet him at the entrance before anyone else could intercept her. "Is it over?" she asked. "Not yet," he admitted, "but we have bought time, enough time to plan properly." "Plan what exactly?" Daniel hesitated, glancing around to ensure no one else could hear. "Marco believes attachments make men weak. I intend to prove him wrong, not by pushing you away, but by showing him that strength and care are not opposites." Grace's heart pounded, uncertain whether to feel hope or fear at his words. "And if he does not believe you?" "Then we prepare for a different kind of conversation, one I hope we never have to have." That night, unable to sleep, Grace walked down to the small library on the estate's ground floor, hoping to distract her racing mind with a book. She found Daniel already there, sitting by the fireplace, a glass of untouched whiskey beside him, staring into the flames. "You should be resting," she said softly. "I cannot rest knowing you are in danger, because of decisions my family made long before either of us were born." She sat across from him, the warmth of the fire flickering between them. "I do not blame you for any of this, Daniel. It was the first time she had used his first name without the formal address attached, and he noticed immediately, his eyes lifting to meet hers with quiet surprise. "Say that again," he said. "Daniel," she repeated gently. Something shifted in his expression, the walls he had built around himself for years cracking just slightly, enough to let a small, genuine smile through. "I have spent 2 years refusing every woman my family tried to introduce me to," he admitted. "Not because I did not want companionship, but because none of them ever looked at me the way you do. None of them ever cared about the man behind the name, until you dropped that glass of wine and apologized like you had committed the worst mistake of your life." "It felt like it at the time," she said, laughing softly despite the tension of the previous days. "It was the best mistake that has ever happened in this house," Daniel replied, "because it brought you close enough for me to finally see what I had been missing." Outside, unseen by either of them, a car idled quietly at the edge of the property, its headlights off, watching the house with patient, calculated attention. Marco Castellano's warning had not been empty words. Someone had already been sent to observe, to gather information, and to determine exactly how much this maid truly meant to Daniel Whitmore. Information that would soon be used to test exactly how far the rival family was willing to go to protect their fatting control over an empire they refused to let go of quietly. The car outside the estate remained there for 3 nights before anyone noticed it. It was Charlotte who spotted it first, mentioning it casually to Grace while they hung laundry in the early morning air, unaware of the weight her words would carry. "There has been a car parked near the east gate for a few nights now," Charlotte said. "I assumed it was security, but none of the guards seemed to recognize it." Grace's stomach dropped. She said nothing to Charlotte, not wanting to alarm her, but she went straight to find Daniel, who was reviewing documents in his temporary office down the hall. "There is a car watching the house," she said, closing the door behind her. Charlotte noticed it. "The guards do not know who it belongs to." Daniel stood immediately, moving to the window, careful not to be seen from outside. He studied the tree line for a long moment before turning back to her, his expression darkening. "Stay inside today. Do not go near the gardens. Daniel, please tell me what is really happening. I cannot keep living in half-explanations." He exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair, a gesture she had come to recognize as a sign of genuine worry rather than performance. "Marco Castellano does not make idle threats," he admitted. "If there is someone watching this house, it means he is testing how far he can push before I react." "And how will you react?" "Carefully. I refuse to give him a reason to escalate this further." That evening, Nathan arrived unexpectedly, his expression tighter than usual, carrying a folder that he placed firmly on the desk in front of Daniel. "We identified the car," he said. "It belongs to a private security firm known for working closely with the Castellanos. This is not a coincidence." Daniel flipped through the folder, his jaw tightening with each page. "They are gathering information, building a case for why I am unfit to lead the negotiations my father started." "Or building a case for something far worse," Nathan said quietly, his eyes flicking toward the door, where Grace stood listening, unnoticed until that moment. "Say what you mean, Nathan," Daniel said firmly. Nathan hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with Grace present, but continued anyway. "If they believe removing her would weaken your resolve, they may attempt exactly that. I am not saying it to frighten anyone. I am saying it because pretending the danger is smaller than it is will not protect her." The room fell silent. Grace felt the full weight of the situation settle over her, heavier than anything she had experienced since the night Daniel had knocked on her door and told her to pack a bag. "I will not let that happen," Daniel said, his voice low and certain. "You cannot promise that alone," Nathan replied. "Not against an organization with resources equal to ours." "Then we do not fight them alone," Daniel said, an idea visibly forming behind his eyes. We bring this into the open. If the Castellanos believe they can operate quietly, threatening without consequence, then we remove the quiet entirely. Nathan frowned. You mean expose the old arrangement publicly? I mean forcing transparency on both sides. If the details of my father's old deal come to light through controlled channels, channels we manage carefully, then Marco loses the ability to threaten me without also exposing his own family's involvement. It becomes mutually destructive rather than a one-sided risk. That is an enormous gamble, Daniel. It is the only move that protects Grace, without requiring me to become the kind of man my father was. Grace stepped further into the room, her voice steady despite the fear still coursing through her. Do not make this decision only because of me, if this puts more people at risk. This is not only because of you, Daniel interrupted gently. It is because of everyone in this house, everyone who works for my family, everyone who has lived under the shadow of decisions made before they even had a voice. You simply reminded me why I wanted to change things in the first place. Over the following 2 weeks, Daniel worked closely with Nathan and a small trusted legal team to carefully compile records of the original agreement between his father and the Castellano family, records that had been buried for years, records that proved the arrangement had crossed lines even by the loose standards of their world. The plan required precision. Release the information too aggressively, and it could spark violent retaliation. Release it too cautiously, and Marco could dismiss it as an empty threat. During this time, Grace remained mostly confined to the estate, though Daniel made a point of finding time for her each evening, even amid the mounting pressure. They shared quiet dinners in the small dining room, conversations that stretched late into the night, moments where the danger outside seemed to fade, if only temporarily. Tell me about your mother, Daniel asked one evening, genuine curiosity in his voice. You mentioned she is unwell. She has been sick for years, Grace said softly. It is why I came to the city in the first place, to find work that could support her treatment. She does not know the details of where I work now. I never wanted her to worry. Would she worry, knowing about all of this? Grace laughed quietly, though there was sadness in it. She would worry about everything, Daniel. That is simply who mothers are. I would like to meet her someday, he said, surprising her with the sincerity in his voice. If circumstances ever allow it. You would want to meet the mother of your maid. Daniel reached across the table, taking her hand gently. I would want to meet the mother of the woman I am falling in love with, regardless of her occupation. The words hung in the air between them, honest and unguarded, and for a moment, Grace forgot entirely about the danger surrounding them, about the car that had once idled outside the gates, about the rival family plotting against the man sitting across from her. But the peace did not last. 3 days before Daniel planned to release the carefully compiled information, Nathan burst into the estate late at night, his face pale, his voice urgent in a way Grace had never heard before. They know about the plan, he said, barely able to catch his breath. Someone leaked it. Marco knows we intend to expose the old arrangement. Daniel's expression hardened instantly. How? I do not know yet, but he has already made contact, demanding a meeting tomorrow. He says if we proceed with exposure, he will ensure there are consequences beyond business. Grace felt the blood drain from her face. Consequences meaning me. Nathan did not answer directly, which confirmed her fear entirely. Daniel stood, packing the length of the room, his mind racing through possibilities, each one more dangerous than the last. Then we move up the timeline, he said finally. If he already knows, waiting only gives him more time to prepare a response. We release everything tomorrow morning before his meeting even takes place. That is reckless, Nathan warned. Reckless is allowing him to control the timeline entirely, Daniel countered. We take the advantage back. That night, sleep was impossible for anyone in the house. Grace sat by the window in her room, watching the dark tree line beyond the gates, her mind cycling endlessly through worst possible outcomes. Around midnight, a soft knock came at her door. She opened it to find Daniel standing there, not with urgency this time, but with quiet vulnerability. "I could not sleep either," he admitted. "Are you afraid?" she asked. "Terrified," he said honestly. "Not for myself, for you, for everyone in this house who trusted me to protect them." She stepped aside, allowing him into the room, and they sat together on the small couch by the window, neither speaking for a long while, simply existing together in the quiet uncertainty of what tomorrow might bring. "Whatever happens," Grace finally said, "I do not regret any of this. Not the wine glass, not the danger, not any of it." Daniel turned to her, his eyes searching hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Neither do I," he whispered, before closing the distance between them entirely, their first kiss carrying all the fear, hope, and quiet desperation of two people who understood exactly how fragile the moment truly was. The following morning arrived with a tension so thick it seemed to hang over the entire estate like a storm cloud refusing to break. Daniel left before sunrise, accompanied by Nathan and a small team of trusted associates, carrying with them the documents that would either resolve years of dangerous entanglement or ignite a conflict none of them could fully control. Grace remained behind, packing the halls of the estate, checking her phone every few minutes for any word, any sign that Daniel was safe. Charlotte tried to distract her with small tasks in the kitchen, but nothing eased the knot of fear tightening in Grace's chest with each passing hour. By midday, when the first news reports began circulating quietly through business channels about irregularities uncovered in old corporate agreements linked to both the Whitmore and Castellano families, Grace understood that the plan had been set into motion. There was no turning back now. And somewhere across the city, in a private office overlooking the skyline, Marco Castellano read the reports with a controlled calm that masked the fury building beneath his composed exterior. He set the papers down slowly, turned to the man standing beside his desk, and spoke with quiet, deliberate menace. "Find out everything about this Maid," he said. "If Daniel Whitmore wishes to play this game publicly, then perhaps it is time the entire city learns exactly what he is willing to risk for a woman who does not even belong to his world." Daniel returned to the estate late that afternoon, his suit slightly disheveled, his expression carrying the exhaustion of a man who had spent hours negotiating on a knife's edge. Grace ran to meet him at the door, searching his face for any sign of what had happened. "It is done," he said, before she could even ask. "The information is public within the right circles. Marco can no longer threaten exposure without exposing his own family equally." "Then it is over." Daniel's expression did not carry the relief she expected. "It is contained for now. But men like Marco do not simply accept defeat. He will look for another way to regain control, another point of pressure." "Meaning me," Grace said quietly. "Meaning I need you to be more careful than ever," Daniel replied, taking her hands in his. "Marco is not a man who loses gracefully." That evening, the household staff noticed a shift in Daniel's demeanor. He remained composed during the day, managing business calls and meetings with the same calculated precision he always had. But each night, he found his way back to Grace, as though her presence alone reminded him why the risks he had taken mattered. Charlotte, ever perceptive, pulled Grace aside one afternoon while preparing tea. "You should know," she said carefully, "that Daniel's mother has heard about you. She is planning to visit within the week." Grace's stomach tightened. "Does she know everything, about the danger, about who I am?" "She knows enough," Charlotte said, "and from what I understand, she is not entirely pleased." The following days passed with a strange, uneasy calm, the kind that exists in the space between danger and its inevitable return. Daniel continued fortifying security around the estate, while Nathan worked quietly to monitor any movement from the Castellano family. Grace, meanwhile, found herself preparing for a different kind of confrontation entirely, one she feared almost as much as the danger from outside. Eleanor Whitmore arrived on a gray afternoon, stepping out of a sleek black car with the composed elegance of a woman who had spent decades navigating both business and family expectations. She was polite to Grace during their first meeting, though her politeness carried a distinct coolness that left no doubt about her true feelings. "My son tells me you have become quite important to him," Eleanor said during a private conversation in the estate's sitting room, her tone measured and careful. "I hope you understand the complexities that come with that importance." "I understand there are dangers, if that is what you mean," Grace replied honestly. "I mean more than danger," Eleanor said. "I mean expectation, responsibility. My son carries an entire family legacy on his shoulders, one that requires someone who understands the world he operates in, not someone who stumbled into it by accident." Grace felt the sting of the words, but she refused to look away. "With respect, Mrs. Whitmore, I did not choose this world, but I have not run from it either, even when running would have been far easier." Eleanor studied her for a long moment, something shifting slightly behind her composed expression. "No," she said finally, "it seems you have not." The conversation ended there, but it marked the beginning of a careful, cautious respect that would slowly develop between the two women over the following weeks, built not on approval alone, but on Grace's steady refusal to be intimidated by circumstances far beyond her control. Meanwhile, Marco Castellano had not remained idle. Having lost his ability to threaten exposure of the old family arrangement, he shifted his focus toward gathering leverage of a different kind. Reports began reaching Nathan of inquiries being made into Grace's background, her family, her mother's medical condition, details that should have remained entirely private. "They are building a profile on her," Nathan warned Daniel during a tense meeting in his office. "If they cannot use the old business arrangement against you, they will find another way to apply pressure. Her mother's medical bills, her family's financial situation, all of it could become tools for manipulation." Daniel's expression darkened considerably. "Then we ensure her mother is protected immediately. Move her to a private facility, one with proper security, regardless of cost. And if Grace asks why her mother is suddenly receiving such treatment, then I will tell her the truth," Daniel said firmly. "I am done hiding things from her that directly affect her safety." That evening, Daniel sat Grace down and explained everything: the inquiries being made, the potential targeting of her mother, the steps he intended to take to protect her family entirely. Grace listened with growing alarm, her hands trembling slightly as the reality of how deeply this danger extended finally settled over her. "This is bigger than I ever imagined," she admitted quietly. "My mother has nothing to do with any of this." "I know," Daniel said gently, taking her hands in his. "Which is exactly why I intend to protect her the same way I intend to protect you." "Why would you do all of this for me?" Daniel's expression softened, the walls he had carried for years completely absent in that moment. "Because, for the first time since my father passed this empire onto me, I do not feel alone in carrying it. You did not ask for any of this responsibility, yet you have faced it with more courage than most people born into this world ever manage." Grace felt tears forming, though she fought to hold them back. "I am frightened, Daniel, not for myself alone, but for everyone this danger touches." "Fear is reasonable," he said, "but we will face it together, not separately." Over the following days, arrangements were quietly made to relocate Grace's mother to a private medical facility outside the city, staffed with discreet security personnel, who ensured her safety without alarming her about the true reasons behind such precautions. Grace visited briefly, careful to keep the visit short and controlled, though the sight of her mother resting comfortably in proper care brought a wave of relief that eased some of the constant tension gripping her chest. Back at the estate, however, tension continued building. Marco, having failed to gather sufficient leverage through Grace's family, shifted his approach entirely. He requested a formal meeting with Daniel, one framed as an attempt at reconciliation, but carrying an unmistakable undertone of calculated threat. "He wants to meet in person," Nathan reported. "Neutral location, minimal security allowed on either side." "It could be a trap," Daniel said. "It could also be his genuine attempt to negotiate a resolution before this conflict escalates further," Nathan countered. "Refusing outright risks appearing as though you have something to hide." Daniel considered carefully before agreeing to the meeting, though he insisted on additional precautions Nathan quietly arranged without informing Marco's team. Grace, learning of the planned meeting, felt a fresh wave of fear settle over her. "Do not go," she pleaded. "Please, Daniel, this feels like exactly the kind of trap Marco would set. If I refuse, he gains the narrative that I am afraid, weak, unwilling to face him directly. That perception alone could invite further aggression. And if something happens to you during this meeting—" Daniel took her face gently in his hands. "Then know that everything I have done, every risk I have taken, has been to ensure that whatever happens to me, you and everyone connected to this house remain protected." The words did little to ease her fear, but she understood the necessity behind his decision, even as dread settled heavily in her chest. The meeting took place 3 days later, in a private restaurant closed entirely for the occasion, both men arriving with minimal visible security, though Nathan had quietly ensured additional protection remained stationed nearby, hidden from obvious view. Marco greeted Daniel with practiced civility, gesturing toward the table already set for their conversation. "I appreciate you agreeing to meet," he said smoothly. "Despite our recent disagreements, I believe reasonable men can still find common ground." "That depends entirely on what common ground you are proposing," Daniel replied evenly. Marco leaned back, studying him carefully. "I propose we cease this public exposure of old arrangements before it damages both our families irreparably. In exchange, I am willing to cease any further inquiries into matters personal to you, including the maid you have grown so attached to." "And what exactly would you require in exchange for such generosity?" Marco's smile did not reach his eyes. "Simply a guarantee that future business dealings between our families continue under terms similar to the original arrangement, minus the specific activities you found so objectionable. A modernized partnership, if you will." Daniel studied him carefully, recognizing the offer for what it truly was, an attempt to maintain influence and control under a different guise entirely. "I am willing to discuss modernized partnership terms," he said carefully, "but only under complete transparency, with legal documentation reviewed by independent parties from both families." Marco's expression tightened slightly at the mention of independent oversight, a detail that clearly did not sit well with him. "Transparency has never been necessary in our world before." "Perhaps that is exactly why our world has remained so dangerous for so long," Daniel replied firmly. "I am willing to build a partnership, Marco, but not one built on the same fear and control that defined my father's arrangements." The conversation continued for nearly an hour, both men carefully navigating a delicate balance of negotiation and unspoken threat, neither willing to fully reveal their true position. By the meeting's end, no formal agreement had been reached, though a fragile, temporary ceasefire settled between the two families, enough to ease immediate danger, though far from resolving the underlying tension entirely. Daniel returned to the estate that evening, relief evident in his posture despite the continued uncertainty ahead. Grace met him at the entrance, searching his face anxiously. "It went as well as could be expected," he said, pulling her into an embrace that lingered longer than necessary. both of them needing the reassurance of simple physical closeness after days of mounting fear. "Is it truly over?" she asked, her voice muffled against his chest. "Not entirely," Daniel admitted honestly. "But we have bought time, real time, to build something stronger than the fear Marco relies upon." That night, as they sat together in the quiet study, the fire crackling softly beside them, Daniel turned to Grace with an expression more vulnerable than she had ever seen from him. "I have spent my entire life believing love was a weakness in this world," he admitted. "A distraction that powerful men could not afford. But watching you face every danger this world has thrown at you, with more courage than I ever expected, has taught me something entirely different." "What has it taught you?" she asked softly. "That love, real love, is not weakness at all. It is the very thing worth protecting the Empire for in the first place." Grace felt her heart swell with an emotion she had been afraid to fully acknowledge until that moment. "I love you too, Daniel," she whispered. "Despite every danger, every fear, every reason logic tells me I should have walked away weeks ago." He smiled, pulling her closer, then let logic remain wrong for once. Outside, unseen by either of them, the fragile ceasefire with Marco Castellano continued holding, though neither Daniel nor Grace fully understood how temporary that peace truly was, nor how soon it would be tested by a final, desperate move from a man, unwilling to accept losing control over an empire he had spent his entire life believing belonged to his family as much as it belonged to the Whitmores. The call came in the middle of the night, 3 weeks after the fragile ceasefire had settled between the two families. Nathan's voice on the phone carried an urgency that pulled Daniel out of sleep instantly. "Marco's men were seen near the private facility where Grace's mother is staying," Nathan said. "Security intercepted them before they gained access, but this was not a coincidence, Daniel. He is testing the boundaries of our agreement." Daniel sat up immediately, reaching for Grace, who was already stirring beside him, sensing the tension in his sudden movement. "What is happening?" she asked, fear creeping into her voice. "Marco attempted to reach your mother," Daniel said honestly, refusing to hide the truth from her any longer. "Security stopped them, but he is sending a message. He wants us to know he can still reach the people we care about." Grace felt her chest tighten with fear, but beneath the fear, something else began to build, a quiet determination she had not fully recognized in herself until that moment. "Then we need to stop reacting to his threats and start controlling the situation ourselves," she said firmly. Daniel looked at her, surprised by the steadiness in her voice despite the danger surrounding them. "What do you have in mind?" "You said Marco values control above everything else, that losing influence terrifies him more than any direct confrontation. What if instead of continuing to defend against his threats, we offer him something that satisfies his need for control without endangering anyone further?" "Such as?" "A public partnership announcement, one that ties his family's reputation directly to the legitimate business ventures you proposed, in a way that makes attacking you or anyone connected to you directly damaging to his own public image. Men who value control fear public embarrassment more than private negotiation failures." Daniel stared at her, a slow, proud smile forming despite the tension of the moment. "You continue to surprise me, Grace. I have spent my entire life finding ways to survive difficult situations with very little power of my own," she said. "This is simply a larger version of the same problem." The following morning, Daniel called an emergency meeting with Nathan and his legal team, presenting Grace's idea with careful refinement. Within days, careful arrangements were made to draft a public announcement, one framed as a modernized business alliance between the Whitmore and Castellano families, emphasizing legitimate ventures, transparency, and mutual growth, effectively tying Marco's public reputation to peaceful cooperation rather than continued threat. When the proposal was presented to Marco through formal channels, his initial reaction, according to Nathan's sources, was fury at being cornered so publicly. However, as the implications settled, he recognized the impossible position he now occupied. Rejecting the public partnership would expose his continued aggression, damaging his family's standing among other powerful circles who valued stability over conflict. Accepting it, meanwhile, forced him into the exact transparency Daniel had wanted from the beginning. 3 days later, Marco requested one final private meeting with Daniel, this time without pretense of civility. "You have backed me into a corner," Marco said bluntly, seated across from Daniel in the same private restaurant as before. "I have offered you a way forward that does not require destroying either of our families," Daniel replied evenly. "The choice of how to view that offer belongs entirely to you." Marco studied him for a long moment, something shifting behind his controlled expression, not quite respect, but perhaps a grudging acknowledgement of defeat handled with unexpected skill. "The maid," he said finally. "This was her idea, was it not?" Daniel did not deny it. "She understands leverage better than most people born into positions of power ever learn to." Marco laughed quietly, though there was little humor in it. "Perhaps you are not the weak man I believed you to be, Daniel Whitmore. Very well. I accept the partnership terms publicly on the condition that all future negotiations occur through legitimate channels only." "Agreed," Daniel said, extending his hand. Marco shook it firmly, though his eyes carried a warning that lingered long after the handshake ended. "Do not mistake this agreement for friendship. I simply understand when a battle is no longer worth fighting." "That is more than enough for me," Daniel replied. The public announcement was made 1 week later, covered quietly but effectively through legitimate business channels, framing the new partnership as a modernization of old family ties, emphasizing legal, transparent ventures moving forward. The immediate danger that had hung over Grace, her mother, and the entire Whitmore estate finally began to lift, replaced by a cautious, guarded peace neither Daniel nor Grace fully trusted at first, though with each passing day, the absence of further threats slowly allowed both of them to breathe more easily. With the immediate danger resolved, Daniel turned his attention toward matters he had ignored during weeks of crisis. He visited Grace's mother personally for the first time, a visit Grace had been quietly anxious about for entirely different reasons than danger. "You must be the reason my daughter has seemed so different in her recent letters," Grace's mother said warmly, studying Daniel carefully from her hospital bed. "More alive, somehow, despite everything she has clearly been through. Your daughter has taught me more about courage and honesty in these past months than anyone else in my life," Daniel replied sincerely. "I intend to spend considerable time ensuring she never regrets that lesson." Grace's mother smiled knowingly. She always did have a habit of finding the good in complicated situations. It seems she found quite a complicated situation this time. The three of them laughed together, a genuine, easy laughter that felt entirely foreign after months of tension and fear, yet deeply welcome. Eleanor Whitmore, too, softened considerably in the weeks following the resolved conflict, watching her son navigate danger, not with the cold calculation his father had always demonstrated, but with a careful balance of strength and genuine care that reminded her of qualities she had feared were lost within her family entirely. "I misjudged you," Eleanor admitted to Grace one afternoon, the two women sharing tea in the estate's quiet garden. "I believed you were simply an accident that happened to my son, something temporary that circumstances forced upon him. I see now that you were exactly the influence this family desperately needed." "I never intended to change anything," Grace said honestly. "I only wanted to survive working in this house without causing trouble." Eleanor laughed softly. "And yet here we are, an entire family legacy shifted because a maid dropped a glass of wine and refused to lie about her fear afterward." Months passed, the estate slowly returning to a version of normal neither Daniel nor Grace had ever truly experienced before, one built not on fear and control, but on honesty and quiet partnership. Daniel restructured significant portions of the family business, moving decisively away from the dangerous entanglements his father had built, focusing instead on legitimate ventures that no longer required constant vigilance against rival threats. Grace, meanwhile, found herself in an entirely new position within the household, no longer simply staff, though she resisted any sudden elevation that felt undeserved or rushed. She continued working closely with the household for a while longer, insisting on earning respect through her own efforts rather than accepting status handed to her without merit. It was on a quiet evening, nearly a year after the night she had first dropped that fateful glass of wine, that Daniel led her back to that same hallway, the marble floor gleaming under soft evening light exactly as it had that first night. "Do you remember this spot?" he asked, a soft smile playing at his lips. "How could I forget?" Grace replied, laughing gently. "It was the worst moment of my life at the time. And now it feels like the beginning of everything that truly matters." Daniel reached into his pocket, producing a small velvet box that made Grace's breath catch entirely. "I have refused every woman my family has ever introduced me to," he said softly, kneeling before her in the exact spot where broken glass had once scattered across polished marble. "Not because I was incapable of love, but because none of them ever saw me the way you did, from the very first innocent mistake that brought us together. Grace Bennett, will you allow me the privilege of building the rest of my life alongside you?" Tears filled her eyes as she nodded, unable to find words adequate enough for the moment. "Yes," she finally whispered. "Yes, Daniel." He slipped the ring onto her finger, standing to pull her into an embrace that carried within it every fear, every danger, every quiet moment of connection they had built together since that very first night. Outside the grand windows of the estate, the city lights glimmered peacefully, no longer carrying the weight of hidden threats or dangerous shadows, simply reflecting the quiet, hard-earned peace two people had built together against every possible odds. Word spread quickly through both business and social circles about the unexpected union between the notoriously guarded Daniel Whitmore and the maid who had once worked quietly within his household. Some whispered about scandal, others about fairy tales come true, but neither Daniel nor Grace paid much attention to the noise surrounding their story. What mattered to them in the end was simple: a single innocent mistake, a shattered glass of wine on a cold marble floor, had brought together two people from entirely different worlds, testing them through danger, family expectation, and rival threats, only to prove that genuine connection, built on honesty rather than status, could withstand challenges neither of them ever imagined facing. And within the walls of that grand estate, where fear had once dictated every decision made by the Whitmore family for generations, love finally found the space to grow freely, protected not by power or control, but by two people who had chosen honesty over fear, courage over convenience, and each other over every danger the world had tried to place between them.